Welcome to Uncomfortable Conversations about Culture and Christianity. My name is Alex, and today I'm joined by Jess.
Hello, world.
Yes, that's right. We are missing something,
A
missing
very important
someone
part of the trio.
today. Eric is not able to be with us. Eric,
We're
if you're
feeling
listening, when
We
you
love
edit
you.
this, we love you.
We do.
And
It's not the same.
I'll give you my Venmo. You can send me some money too for saying that. No, just kidding. So that got me
Mine
thinking.
was free.
Jess,
so that keeps me in favor.
we won't answer the voicemail we have because I think it's not fun to do it without Eric.
Yeah, don't tell us
Feels
what
like
it is.
something's missing.
We'll save it as a surprise.
As we look across the table. So the question I have, just quick banter, is when was the last time like you were missing something and that you were kind of like anxious about it? It kind of made you start to freak out. Or do you like
in what context?
Just anything. It could be a child. It could be
Oh, like I lost something?
Yeah. And then you just like knew something was missing. You just sensed, I'm not whole right now.
Oh, gosh.
Like besides this moment right now without Eric
I know.
being with
Well,
us.
that's probably the most recent is Eric.
Yeah. I know for me,
Do you have
like
one?
if I don't, and it's become this, like if I don't have my cell phone, then it's just that one of those weird things. You just don't, it's amazing how much you're like, what do I do with my hands right now? Like there's been times, it's probably a couple weeks ago, like I left the house without my cell phone and came to work and you just don't realize how much you use it. Not even just for like it's like the timer, you know, or like you like, oh, I need my calculator. You just don't realize outside of even the functionality of it being a cell phone and
The practical
maybe the
ways you
addictive
use
parts.
it.
Yeah, just the practical things. You're like, what time is it? You reach in your, oh, I don't know. My AirPods can't tell me. My wallet can't tell me. Oh, I guess I have a watch on. Now I'll look at my watch and tell me the time. So you have anything? Did I give you long
mine's
enough?
probably similar stuff. I feel like I always like will set something down, like my keys, or if I use my debit card and I put it in my pocket and I don't put it back in my wallet, it's something where I like when I don't finish the task all the way, then I lose it. So like if I don't put my keys away, then I can't find them, and I'm usually texting Ben or like hollering for someone in the house to come help me. But I definitely feel like when I get moving too fast, I do lose things, and then I do feel anxious. So
well, if you would finally get yourself an iPhone, and then if you do that, Eric and I will go in for you and buy you an AirTag, so you don't have to lose your phone. You'll be able to, your keys. If you lose your phone,
like
it's harder to find.
If I had an
AirTag.
Apple, I would want an AirTag on, like sewn into every child's jacket.
Yeah, so maybe
the car. I don't know.
You know, we'll buy
maybe
you
it's
one.
In my future.
We're not going to buy you several, but if you do, then
if I
we
make
will.
the plunge,
yeah. If we finally convince you that our side of this culture war between Apple and Android is the right way to go, then we will reward you for your allegiance to our side with an AirTag, which is my way of segueing into what we're talking about today. So today, we're going to have a conversation with Dr. Karl Pagenkemper. He's joining us today.
Always love when he joins us.
Yeah, and we're going to be talking today about cultural wars and spiritual warfare. What is it? What's the difference? How do they intersect? And it's going to be a fun conversation. So listen in.
Let's go.
Well, as promised, we are going to have a conversation today about just the cultural wars, cultural battles in the landscape of that, and then spiritual warfare. And like we said earlier, Eric is not able to be with us today, but we have found not quite as handsome of a replacement, but definitely a more educated replacement today. Maybe not in video games, but at least you've got the nice things behind your name, PhD and stuff like that. So Dr. Karl Pagenkemper is joining us for this conversation, which...
An uncomfortable favorite.
Yeah, uncomfortable. We've missed him.
It's been a long time.
It's been a long time.
Welcome back.
Well, thank you.
So grateful to have you in this conversation. I know even just being in message team with you pretty much every week, there's always these things that as we're talking about things in culture and spiritual warfare, you bring a lot of insight to that. So
I'm a crank, basically, and but sometimes you speak and sometimes you don't.
Yeah, and so today we're hoping you speak. Just to kind of help us ground ourselves in maybe what we're saying or what the topic is surrounding. There's just cultural wars, cultural battles, whatever you want to call it, I think a few of those that are probably hotbed cultural things happening right now are gender identity and pronouns. How do we say those? Maybe it's religious freedom. How much religious freedom should we have? There's probably LGBTQ plus rights and racial justice, police reform. Those are some of the things probably at the forefront of cultural war. Do you guys have other things that you're thinking are at the forefront of culture wars?
Well, we just watched the House go through 3 weeks worth of paroxysms because they couldn't find a speaker, and you have a division in the Republican Party, which is almost untenable.
Yeah.
So I think today I just heard that maybe they've made a decision, and it's not going to be happy to most. It doesn't matter what it was going to be. So yeah, politics.
Politics, yes, and a lot of these, maybe the political landscape is where a lot of the blood is shed or the war is fought.
Yeah.
And in light of the fact you mentioned wars, we're there too. We're really unsettled in our culture right now.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things to be unsettled about between the Middle East, Ukraine, politics,
Palestine, Israel.
that whole thing.
There's a lot happening.
Yeah.
And the good news is we're heading into an election cycle, so it's probably going to just tame down a little bit more.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's just going to get quiet for a while.
No.
So I think that's why having this conversation is important. As believers, we know that there's a spiritual warfare happening. We're going to have, Rob Reamer showing up here next week and somebody that's kind of an expert really in helping lead our church through that next week. And so we just know it's real. And we're in, the precipice of Halloween, and that always brings these conversations up. But then there are these cultural battles that need to be fought. And so just for definition, to help us kind of separate the two, spiritual warfare is the concept of fighting against the work of pre-natural evil forces. So if you don't know what pre-natural is, these are those that appear outside of or beside the natural. So some would call that supernatural, but by this definition, saying pre-natural. But it's based on the biblical belief in evil spirits or demons that are said to intervene in human affairs in various ways. So I borrowed that definition from Dr. Clinton Arnold. And so I thought that kind of summed up spiritual warfare. Anything else you would add to that, Karl?
Sure. Historically, we are in a relatively secular age. One of the most important books written in the last 40 years, Charles Taylor on Secular Age, where he's suggesting that we have moved in the last 500 years from a very enchanted world where that spiritual realm, the very nature of belief in gods and powers was so normal, to a period of time where the social imaginary that we live in now allows us to say we can live a life without the presence of spiritual beings with God. So we're caught in a kind of a pre-modern, post-modern eclipse because of that. Many who don't buy any spiritual, and many who are just so overwhelmed by the spiritual thing, they're afraid under every rock shows a demon. So we're in a very, very weird time. And in this post-modern realm right now, where the social imaginary of the purely secular realm is now being questioned because Wicca, spirituality is, it's back on the table in a full-blown smorgasbord, and people are very interested in spiritual things again, where in a classic modern world they were moving away from it. We're back in the middle of it again, which is the strangest thing. So the world continues to change. Is there a preternatural, I think is the language I would use, this beings out there that are involved with all parts of life and that we don't see them?
Yeah. And so, obviously, from the Christian worldview, we get a lot of this idea from the beginning of time. There's angels, there's demons, there's a God, Yahweh, that created things. But, passages I think that often quote that relate to this are, Ephesians 6 talks about our spiritual armor, and it says our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against authorities, against powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realm. So this outlines it. Paul's talking about that. And again, Paul talks about this in a lot of places. In 2 Corinthians, he talks about it. We live in a world, but we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons that we fight with are not the weapons of the world. They're not bombs and guns. They're these spiritual weapons. And so as as people that are Christian, I think we're aware that we live in this war. There's this cosmic war happening outside. I kind of hearken it to behind the scenes. Like you see a play. If you've been to a play, you see everything happening on the stage. Yet if you've been a part of a play, there's so much more happening behind the scenes to make that scene visible, and so it's hard to understand. Now there's cultural war, and for a definition of this, a culture war is conflict between social groups that struggle to impose their own virtues, beliefs, and practices on society. And so those are more things that are happening in our culture, but don't necessarily have to involve, this is human-to-human conflict for the most part. It doesn't have to involve supernatural. Now, where it gets weird, and I think why we're having this conversation is like, where does the overlap happen? How much overlap happens? And so we'll kind of talk through, I think, some of those things today.
Yeah, we know the social battle because we live in a country there where culture war is common and has been since its beginning because we have worried about the tyranny of the majority. So we've wanted to give the minority a voice in our culture. So culture war is very common, but we also we love the idea that people could become more like what our moral standards are. So that's where the social conflict comes. The query becomes, what's the gray line between the spiritual component and just the cultural component? And that's where the truth of the matter is it's a gray line. It's a little bit like one of those lime lines you put right on a field, and it gets rubbed out, and you're not sure where that 50-yard line was. It happens all the time, and we're not sure at times. And the truth of the matter is that all the time, both of them are probably involved.
Yeah.
Almost all the time.
And I think, Jess, like right now, there's a big resurgence, and I think in a good way, of people, especially in the church, feeling permission to think about their mental health in ways that maybe previously everything was a demon, or you were weak if you went and sought counsel and counseling, therapy, things like that. And so I think that's a good thing. But as a counselor, how do you start to think through, okay, what of this battle that somebody's fighting, whether it's depression, anxiety, or other, things that are diagnosable, are these human emotions and conflict happening? Maybe it's conflict between people, and how much of that is spiritual? How do you start to wrestle through that?
I think for a long time that mental health was and even if you're like looking back in history, like a lot of times when someone was struggling or dealing with something related to mental health, it was considered a spiritual thing, or it was automatically assumed to be something that was attributed to spiritual warfare or something like that. And I think even as Christians, as we wrestle with, okay, what's mental health, it's hard for us not to kind of put that on top of somebody and say, okay, well, what could this be? I think the beauty in mental health now is that we can separate it, but obviously we're still integrating our faith and looking at it, but we can see someone. I think like professionals can separate it, and they can say, okay, what are the diagnosis like, and really get into the details and the weeds with somebody. But I think that's what we have to do, is to have those conversations and not make the overarching judgments. So to me, it's like if someone's saying, okay, well, this person like has anxiety and like there's all this stuff going on, I'm like, okay, I'm not going to make a snap judgment. Even if someone's talking about somebody else, I'm like, I can't put that on them. Because to me, using wisdom and discernment in my faith says, well, I can't put necessarily spiritual warfare or something demonic onto somebody where maybe it could be something else. But it feels like we get right in the weeds, because I think we do need discernment. We need wisdom. I think even when you're talking, Alex, it's like sensing something going on in the background. I'm like, that takes, as Christians, like some of our spiritual gifts to be able to make determination. So, yeah.
Well, you get Matthew 4 where Jesus is carrying on ministry. And it says that he healed the lame, the epileptic, and the demonized. I suspect that they were just as aware of the distinctions. They might not have known exactly where the demonic looked like epilepsy and vice versa, but they knew the distinction. And that's striking to me, because the assumption that many people make is that they just confused them. they understood that they were distinct. Now, they might have known that there were overlap, and that's the problem, is you can't always tell. So in a given presentation, you may say, okay, I can't tell whether this is a spiritual conflict or just anxiety, something in their youth. And I probably go the other way. I tend to think more, let's deal with what we see in front of us first, rather than dig too far back into some spiritual warfare. But you get to a point where it's intractable, and you go, there's something going on here that's beyond the obvious conversation.
Mm-hmm. So and obviously we're using anxiety just as an example.
Yeah.
Well, because I think that's one of those scripturally, especially passages that gets thrown around, be anxious for nothing, but in everything, be in prayer and supplication, take it to the Lord. And so I think that's one of those.
It's what we ought, I think one of the, we tend to think of that one first.
Yeah. Especially in a spiritual. So how as Christians do we start to discern the difference between a cultural battle and spiritual warfare? How do we start? You said we need to use a lot of discernment, Jess, wisdom, those types of things. So how do we start to, make a discernment if it is, a hot button cultural issue that's happening in politics or whatever? How do we start to figure out how much of this is spiritual? How much of this is just a cultural battle, misunderstanding, you see life through different lenses and it's okay for you and for me it's not, and we're just going to be at odds, and not all of that is spiritual. Not all of it is, it's practical being flawed humans that just have to learn to live in society together.
The answer is there's no explicit answer in every case. I think they're very contextually defined, specifically defined, and each circumstance differs. I think an awful lot, the reason we're having cultural discussions right now is because we're in so much cultural flux. We are, rivers of groups of people. If you've ever been to Three River Stadium, you kind of realize that where those rivers come together, it's really turbulent. We're in times of change. And when times of change are happening, turbulence happens and people get hurt. So you see this of a humongous amount. So is it people I'm dealing with, or are there something deeper? And the answer is there often is something deeper. The problem is we have to make sure we rightly identify the enemy. The enemy is not the person across the table, or whether they're political people or social warriors or whatever. They're not the real problem. Now, I may be engaged with them as a real problem, but I also have to be engaged with image bearers who I can't demean. I don't have that right. We've gone through history with that. We know from our own history of slavery. We know from the racial divides that are still going on in our country. It's not just here. It's all over the world. We know the way you actually have these kinds of power-ups often have to do with demeaning people who are image bearers. If we can make them 3/4 or 3/5 of a person, or maybe not have the image of God, and we can get away with it. I don't think we can get away with it. So the first posture we have to figure is make sure we understand who the real enemy is, and it's usually not the person across the street. And when we demonize them, we bring warfare language at people who are we can diminish, and then we can land on them. So we own them, and our job is to flatten them. We don't just want to win the case; we want to annihilate them. And that's my great fear right now in the political realm is you own the other side. Your job is to destroy them. You hate them because they're the enemy. But that's the cultural war issue degenerates to that when in fact we should be having real life conversation. I think we need to have robust arguments and then be able to go out for coffee. I mean, I don't mean to be flip about that. How do we engage real live people? Because there's usually lives behind those guys. There's children and families. There's backgrounds to every person we interact with. And then if we can identify them as the other, then it makes it a whole lot easier. That's why social media is so easy as a target. It's a vehicle by which to condemn. So that tells you how complicated this discussion is. I don't think there's an absolute right answer in any given situation. Almost all cultural conflict is spiritual at some level. But whether it doesn't matter at some level, we don't get the right to suddenly become ungodly in our warfare. And that's why I'm hesitant to use the word warfare. I actually am hesitant to use the word warfare even in spiritual warfare, because so many people view this as they have history and watch Christians engage warfare, fundamentalists engage warfare, and even the language frightens people. So that's inside language for us. We realize that there is such a thing as a warfare that goes on. But God is not intimidated by war. I mean, spiritual warfare, we're worried about who's going to win. Guess what? He's not. This is the one thing I preach about at Reamer. This isn't a battle at that level. The battle is in our eyes, but God's not bothered in the least.
Yeah, he knows he's going to win. Yeah, and I think go.
I was just going to say that for me, using discernment as a believer, I always think, especially when it's a hot button topic, I have to consciously slow down.
Good.
And I want to listen and I want to hear and I want to be able to discern. And to me, like when I'm out of control or I feel like I could like pop off on something, that to me is my red flag. So I think we need to figure out like what are those things that like when we get out of control, we cannot discern. So for me, it's like when I need to slow down, I need to get the information. I understand that there is a battle for not just, we can throw out like the big overarching topics, but it's a battle for me. It's a battle for my family and for my kids. And so to me, I slow down. And that's when I need to be praying. That's when I need to be asking God, like, okay, I need wisdom and I need the wisdom of the Holy Spirit here to guide me and to help me to see the truth and the lie in a situation. And so for me, it's like, that's how I discern between, what is spiritual, what's cultural. Let me slow down and separate it instead of like throwing it into a blender and like screaming at it.
Yeah. That's good. And I think there's mild culture wars that I think just capitalism creates, right? Like I think of just like, everyone does the Chipotle or Qdoba or Apple or Android. You've got
toilet paper one way or the other.
Yeah, you've got, Coke and Pepsi. So there's this fun.
There's only really
wars.
One option in any of those cases. You do understand that. There's really only one option.
Correct. But there are people that will treat some of those very tertiary cultural, things, brand, whatever, loyalty, as they'll dehumanize people based on those. But I think at the core, like it's just part of a capitalistic society to have this constant warfare. And I love that you're talking about that language, because I think that language does lean into it is me versus someone. It's a battle language, and thus in war there's always casualty. And one of the things that I often am thinking about, even in parenting, and I share this probably quite a bit, is am I fighting with my kids or am I fighting for my kids? Am I fighting with my spouse or am I fighting for my spouse? And there's a real enemy that wants to create disunity, division, and get us to fight, to think this is a war against that person instead of fighting, for them. And we have to realize as Christians overall, I think that we are not in a battle with our opponents, we're in a battle for our opponents. Jesus didn't show up to battle with those who sent him to the cross. He showed up to lay his life down. Right. In fact, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Yet, I think when we start to make conversations or we over-spiritualize that cosmic level, which I understand, this is a real spiritual battle, and I have the ability to see that there's spiritual behind that. But I think one of the dangers of that is it starts to create like people that are passive towards, what cult, like where do I take a stand in justice? Yes, ultimately I believe God wins. God will get vengeance. God will get justice. And yet right in front of me, there are people starving. There's people that don't have equal rights. There's people that they're living in somewhat of a living hell because of circumstances that are cultural in our life. And God does invite us to start to bring that kingdom now, not just wait for his return or for him to bring justice, but he invites us to be justice bringers and to be people that are bringing unity. So how do we start to not just overly dive into the spiritual world? Because I think that's one of the cautions that we could have. And how do we start to properly see how we engage in those cultural spaces? Because we are citizens of heaven and the kingdom, yet we're citizens of America or Omaha, and there are real issues that you said we have to debate and be able to get coffee with after. So how do we start to not over spiritualize it and have that proper perspective of, no, but I'm called in this place to make a difference and to stand, and these are important issues.
Yeah, I really appreciate, first of all, as you say, the first thing to do is slow down. I agree totally. And probably the second thing to do is, before I sound off, I'd better get some input. Typically, the reason that academics tend to be more flexible on all kinds of things is because they spend all their time going across country and interacting with colleagues in Europe. One of the challenges we have is being pretty much isolated sometimes in our own selves. And I think all theology is ultimately local. And I say that advisedly because I realize that there are things that we would want to teach here that might not fly in London. The scripture is used to support those things. So I'm talking about cultural type of things and behavior and stuff like that. Yeah, we live in a capitalistic system and broadly monitored, controlled capitalism. It's not complete free-for-all because rich people tend to get richer, and we've done a really good job with that in the last 30 years. Rich people have gotten extraordinarily richer. So the next question would really have to do with the issue of counsel. Can I gain insight from those that are around me as to say, is this an issue as big as it is? The third thing is to realize that I can't fight every battle that's out there. I have to be very aware that God has given us a body. And the reason, a year or two ago, I watched Tim Keller get criticized because he has this winsome style of how he ministers in New York City. And the argument really was, you're about 10 years out of date, that winsome style lost, and now we need to change because the context have changed. And the answer to that question is partial. The world continues to change around us, the different circumstances, and different people are gifted for different things. But I think Keller succeeded quite well to the very end of his life in New York City. That has not been winsomely in 50 years. It's always been. I lived in Philly. City of brotherly shove. We understood that kind of rough and tumble. I mean, even go to an Eagles game, that's a rough and tumble area. And yet he won by being a guy who was fascinatingly interesting and interested in others, and that winsome style. So right now what we see going on in the church is a swing of the pendulum in a completely different direction, and that is because the culture has gone so negative, we need to get negative and get down and get dirty with them as well and go head on and fight every battle we can find. Some battles are not worth fighting for. Second, not everybody's equally skilled or qualified to engage every battle that's out there. I have this history, a remembrance when I was in seminary in Dallas, abortion clinic on the Ruth Street abortion clinic. And you could get extra credit if you'd go down and protest. And I understood the impulse toward that, but I wasn't happy with it because as much as I may be against abortion, I'm not sure every strategy is the best strategy to take to get there. Our objective is not simply to get everybody to hate abortion. Our objective is to reduce abortion. And simply by yelling at people it makes them feel bad, but doesn't necessarily change the numbers. I mean, the one thing I observed under the last Republican president was that abortion rates were actually going up rather than down. That's a very striking thing in light of a president who was declaring that he was against abortion, and yet during that particular set of policies and sort of, what are the best strategies in which to reduce and make abortion not needed? And that's strategy matters. So some people are going to they're going to be better at standing in the corner and counseling, and other people are going to be saying, well, how do we create policies? But it's not just an abortion issue. This goes on all kinds of things, social justice issues, and how is the best way? So different people have different qualities, different strengths, different abilities. Some people need to speak truth into powerful situations. They need to be honest. Now, they need to be winsome and kind as well. You don't lose the fruit of the Spirit just because you got angry. That was a Brant Hansen discussion, how anger very rarely gets you anywhere near where you want to go. Almost nowhere that do you go with anger that you couldn't do better without it. So the ability, though, to speak into those situations, I'm not capable of speaking in all those situations, but other people are. Other people are gifted and skilled, and the church needs those entities out there. So part of it is just realizing what are the limitations of an individual. No given church can do everything you would like to do. But in the broad tapestry of the kingdom of God, God is quite capable of moving people the way he wants to move them. And I suspect when it's all said and done, we're going to look back and say, some of those small churches did amazing things for an awful lot of people that I never even knew about. So we have a bigger perspective of what God is actually doing in the area of justice. That said, what do we see as a need? We're in a church that's about move into some of those things and new ones, and we can't meet every need, but we can meet some. So get after it.
Yeah.
And move positively rather than just yell at it. The war in the Middle East right now is everybody's yelling at one another. Doesn't matter. Pictures of some of the pictures that are coming out of there, which you don't want to describe in public, should turn your stomach. And you can't find a justification in any world that particularly we want to live in that's going to justify what's going on, and maybe what's even going on now, which is what's problematic. So there's a lot of stuff that's going on in the world. We're at a tumultuous moment, and being angry is too easy. Sorry, I'm wandering into this stuff because I feel that impulse. I think everybody feels it. If you're not feeling it, you're not listening. No, some of us would just as soon not listen. But most of us try to stay up. It's a world that feels a little tumultuous. Yeah. And that makes a lot of us uncertain, and the future uncertain. I mean, now you're talking about people who are, is it possible that the U.S. could have a civil war? Now, personally, I doubt it. But is it impossible? And the answer is no. And we haven't thought about that in 150 years. Yeah. Not seriously. I mean, there's always some crank out there. But this is a serious time where we feel the tumultuousness. So learning who better to bring kindness, calmness than the church that's functioning the way it's supposed to. And not the way it often does, but the way it's supposed to. And that is to bring the Spirit of God into the lives of people and saying, okay, we're going to be an unanxious presence in this world to those that are around us. So that's the spiritual warfare we get into. I think we're too busy looking for demons under every rock. And if I read Ephesians 6 correctly, the thing that they're really looking for is faith, and the scriptures and those kinds of things, the righteousness of the gospel, those are the spiritual warfare tools. And you have this image. What really matters are their particular construction. Even in the Greek, it says it's the shield of faith. The faith is the issue, not the shield. The faith is the issue. And we make it into some sort of. We're looking for some sort of weird spiritual behavior. Spiritual warfare starts in spiritual behavior and spiritual tools. So we don't want to be ignorant of those things. So the kind of stuff that we're worried about with some like deliverance ministries, I don't disapprove of those things. I just think we got a long way to go before we get to deliverance ministry.
Yeah, it's good. And I think ultimately we've become so desensitized or okay with innocent casualties along the way in war. Like you talked about and alluded to, what's happening in the Middle East is just, it's heartbreaking and there's just innocent casualties along the way of people fighting for justice and all those things. And I think we've become in the church sometimes okay with innocent, casualties along the way, as long as we get our way, and it becomes painful. I'd like to talk about Jesus, because I think the other thing here is this isn't new. Like we always think that these are new. Like all of a sudden these cultural issues popped up and they've never been addressed, or Jesus didn't really have to deal with, we text messaging or, like our current thing. But at the root, he dealt with a lot of social, cultural issues, and then also the spiritual side of them. I think you alluded to it earlier, Matthew 6, but in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, as he's giving his kingdom manifesto, they're expecting war. They're expecting Jesus to come here and bloody the whole place up and come and rescue the world through physical war. And when Jesus says things like, turn the other cheek, like this is crazy to these people, he's like, they're like, no, we slap them harder and we keep slapping them and punching them until that's just the narrative built into human history. And so Jesus obviously deals with, a lot of these things. I think one of the first ones that comes to my mind, and you guys can bring up some others, is, the woman caught in adultery, in John 8 is adultery is a real sin. It's a real problem. It wrecks lives. We don't know all the circumstances around that, but I've seen adultery wreck marriages, wreck kids' lives. I've seen the real pain that has caused in people's lives in a cultural way. I've seen the financial pain that it's caused. I've seen it's not good. It's not right. It's not okay. And so Jesus shows up on the scene and these guys want to, throw stones at her. And so there's this law, there's a legal precedent for what you do in this kind of situation. And so Jesus shows up, and obviously if you don't know the story, he's like, hey, he was without sin, cast the first stone. And he begins to emphasize forgiveness and repent and grace. And then obviously also gives her an opportunity for repentance. And so Jesus deals with this cultural issue that had real consequences, and yet he shows up and he's not like, it's okay, what you did was fine, and keep doing it. He doesn't say there's no repercussions for what she did. There's still going to be some of that, but he also shows up and meets her in this place, and the religious people are the ones that get the most mad, obviously. And that story, I know there's several others. I don't know if you guys can think of, and how Jesus, is dealing with a cultural issue, but meets it with the cultural norm that he's in, but also in a spiritual sense.
Well, in that particular case, what you have is Jesus initiating with forgiveness. I mean, as bad as sin is, the Lord's response with forgiveness is so gracious. And the upside for me is that in this particular case, that the anger that God has towards sin is a temporary thing. Eventually that's going to be resolved. His affection and love, Jesus always exudes kindness and offers forgiveness. I mean, your sins are forgiven. Okay. Yeah. Who has the right to do that? And they asked that question. The Pharisees asked that question. Who has the right to forgive sins? He does. And I don't know about you, but looking at the mirror in the morning and reminding myself that as flawed as I am, I'm forgiven. Maybe it's my age, but I'm happy about that. That gives me a reason to get up in the morning. And so you create a situation where, obviously they're trying to trap Jesus in John 8. That's the point.
Yeah.
They're trying to undermine him. And there are other places where he's undermining, and he's capable of meeting those situations. As simple as, do you pay taxes or not? That's political. And a cultural issue there. They had lots of cultural issues. They had lots of cultural issues around divorce. There are no simple answers in each case, but Jesus is capable of cutting through those things and saying, yeah, by the way, that coin, whose face is on that? First of all, they probably shouldn't have had a coin with a face on it in the first place. But the idea of the Jesus cutting through all that thing and saying, by the way, the sons of the kingdom, they don't have to pay. But you know what? We're gonna ease it over. We're gonna go ahead and pay for it. Don't want to make that a deal. If that's a deal breaker, because they're trying to trap me and being convinced that I'm either a collaborator or I'm anti-Rome, and I don't want to be either one of those things. And he gets away with it, which is to tell you that we live on a very careful edge. It's easy to go one side or the other, and the balance in the middle is almost always the place to be. Just like most theology and theology questions, somewhere in the middle. People have been thinking about this for 2,000 years. It's not like I came up with this. Even the current cultural wars, I lived through the 60s. No, I was a kid. But if you think it's turbulent now, it was pretty nasty back then. And it changed the course of our culture. We're still living with the fallout and the impact of that. And yet we have swings. it just depends on which side of the aisle you're on. The 80s were one way, and the 70s were another, and 60s were bizarre. Mm-hmm. Well, I also like Woodstock. I wanted to go, and my mom wouldn't let me.
Not happening.
That was where I was.
I also think about Jesus dining with tax collectors,
right?
And just the decisions that he made that weren't understood at the time. And I think that we as Christians, when we respond differently, like we are questioned, I think in similar ways today. But I also think about like healing on the Sabbath. And I think also if you're a visual learner and connecting with this would be more helpful. Even like looking up these scenes in the depiction of the Chosen, I think it really shows the grace and the mercy that Jesus walks into these situations with. But it's also, I don't think it takes away from, like even thinking about the woman at the well caught in adultery. It's like that doesn't take away from the fact that like there was a family that was hurt and hurting. Mm-hmm. But I think that that's the beauty and the power of Jesus, where he walks into these things and he says, I'm presently here and I'm dealing with this. And this is, I'll bring justice and I will rectify this. But then also it's like he goes and he can meet in our hurt and our pain. But it's wild for us to grasp the concept that we have this wild protector Jesus, and then we have this merciful, gracious forgiver. And I think it's the mystery of faith too that I still wrestle with. Man, I've been a Christian for 30 years plus. And it's like it's still in those moments where it's like he was meeting with people. He healed that blind man on the Sabbath. It's like he's stepping into these moments where with intention.
Yeah, I'm. So many of the story you mentioned, eating with tax collectors. The Zacchaeus story almost always comes to mind because there's a guy who, everybody around him is viewed as a pariah. Jesus makes up his own disciples, and he puts Simon the Zealot and Matthew the tax collector on the same team. That's one of the amusing images that goes on inside the Chosen. You just realize they're not normally in the same place. They're not normally talking to one another. And one of the interesting things about the church is, for the most part, the church would not, most of the people that come to the church, you might not normally hang around with these people, but God has created a body intentionally to put differing people together and then called them unity, which is obvious because they need to be called unity because they wouldn't normally be that way. So whether it's the disciples as a whole and you look at the character and the mix of that, or the people that Jesus talks to, Jesus goes up to Zacchaeus and says, come on, I'm going to your place. And they're all saying, hey, Zacchaeus, you're a bad dude. And Jesus is going to whip you. And he flips the script on that completely and says, I'm going to your place. And he responds, I'm going to not only fix this, I'm going to overfix it. Not bad. That's Jesus. I'm fascinated by the fact that everybody wants to be around that guy. He's the holiest guy in the room, and everybody who's not holy actually wants to be near that guy. And the holiest guys in the room are trying to push him away. What's wrong with this picture? He clearly, whether it's Zacchaeus or the woman who, the issue of blood, or all these stories that are going on, he is a freely giving, merciful guy and goes into situations that most of us are afraid of. He's not, and not bothered by it. He's never surprised by sin. He's never surprised by conflict. That's that we have. And I'm not a fighter at home. My wife and I don't fight, but even when we differ, he's never surprised by that stuff. It's not my proclivity. I don't tend to yell or anything like that. It's not mine. But he's never surprised when I'm a little frustrated or angry. Never.
Yeah.
And always hand out come my way. So warfare is an interesting thing. We get I think spiritual warfare in some ways is almost a sidetracking thing. We don't want to be ignorant, but sometimes we see the power encounter stuff that came out of Neil Anderson. I get it, and even with Rob Reimer, I get it. But so many times I think it dominates the discussion. We need to be aware it's always there. But greater is He who's in you. You need to relax and live your life as a godly person, as a faithful person. Will that happen? When it comes up, yeah, we address it. Is it around every corner? I can't be bothered by it most of the time. Nothing personal. I just don't. I'm aware it's real. I've been in the office with Wendell next door when some of those things have gone off. It's a little frightening. And I've been in the Philippines and I've seen stuff. Around China. So I'm aware of it. But most of the time in the daily interaction, what God is looking for is how do we, as Spirit-filled people of fruit of the Spirit, how do we interact with the world around us?
Yeah.
I think when you're saying we need to relax a little bit, I take that for me, through my lens, I hear that as like, we need to have more confidence.
Sure.
I need to have confidence in
That's a good word.
Who Christ is, the power in me. And then as you're saying that too, and I think of, I need to have that confidence. I need to be sober and vigilant. Because what is that? The verse, 1 Peter 5:8. I just had it. Be sober and vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. So my tension is, how do I my tension is tempering that with, okay, I'm not gonna freak out. I'm not gonna overreact. What does that look like in my life? To have the confidence and the awareness that all this is happening. And what does that look like in my life? This doesn't look like going after a specific group and tearing them down if we're talking about culture wars. Like, it's using that wisdom. It's looking at how Jesus stepped into these things with confidence, with the hope of the future, knowing what will happen more than just in a moment. And so I think there's this part where, to me, when I engage in spiritual warfare or spiritual things like this, I'm like, it's a reminder that I'm growing and how much I need Jesus. And in those moments, I need to be praying over these issues and praying for myself and for my family. But it's a lot to engage into. It's what we're saying at the end of the day.
This is a huge issue because
it's a little uncomfortable. Okay.
Okay. I hope so. That was the point of the conversation. I do think that Christians need to not easily be duped about things. I think sometimes we're easily, we consume information poorly, we assess information poorly, and then we pour all kinds of spiritual conflict into things that are not necessarily that at all. So I want us to be careful. I think we need to learn how to be fair-minded with people. Anytime we have a disagreement, I want to steel man the arguments that the other person is making as well as possible, because I need to understand them at their best. If I'm going to have a discussion, whether it's abortion or prison reform or whatever it be, socially, I need to be able to give them the right to have the best argument that they can have, because we may still disagree, but at least I have fairly represented them well. And that's not something that goes on social media easily. You don't have the space and the time to do that. I think it's John Inazu over in St. Louis. He's at the university over there, and I just love the fact that a confident pluralism, living as Christians confidently in a pluralistic world, and the ability to have the conversations and not degenerate into flame throwing. Which is what we so often see. And social media, unfortunately, plays that. And we want to use social media carefully, even as a ministry. But it's so easy to get trapped into those debates. Yeah,
and I love maybe those who are just listening to this episode right now. I love actually the positioning of it, because last week we had Brant Hansen on, who we read through his book as a church, Unoffendable, and really it does lean into, I think, a lot of the non over spiritualized parts of the battle that's happening. Our ability, just don't be offended by everything. Don't be surprised by sin. Don't live life always on the edge, looking to be offended by everything, every cultural battle. Don't be shocked by it. It's giving practical advice, I think, to the very practical, simple, humanistic aspects. And then next week we've got Rob Reamer, who will be joining us, who dabbles more in the spiritual warfare side of things, and And I think that's where it's difficult is people want to land in one of the two. They oversimplify it or they over spiritualify it. And then that's same with grace and truth. It's this balance of how do I walk on that line? How do I do it? And, I in this last series, we talked about being unoffendable and really the miracle of doing that. And the miracle of loving people is a miracle. Being offended by people is easy. Like actually loving someone that's different from you, being in proximity to someone that's different from you. Like often times, like, people maybe will call me a pacifist because I'm not yelling or screaming or I want to have conversations behind closed doors around, sensitive subjects and not just, I don't want to be just thrown in with the lump of a group. I am an individual that has my own complexities in my own sin that, and there's certain things maybe that led me towards those, those sins, whether it's nurture, nature, whatever. I want to be considered as an individual. I want to be heard as an individual. And so I try to do that and not over blanket these issues that we oftentimes just want to throw people into a political talking point and then just put that label on them. And so I don't want to be treated like that. And so I try not to treat others that way. And I try to lead in the most loving, gracious way that I can. But I'm not afraid of like having truthful conversations, difficult conversations in those right spaces. And people sometimes just throw that as a pacifist. And I'm like, it is more radical to get close to someone that's different from you. It's more radical to love someone that is totally opposite politically than you, even spiritually than you. It's more radical what Jesus did. And I'm not calling myself perfect, but it's more radical to love someone, share the truth with them, do life with that person than it is to just reject them. Like that, the reject button is easy, not getting close to people is easy. Getting angry at people is easy. Making somebody an issue, that's all the simple stuff. And then I can just have posted it online and said, I'm against these people. And I shouted out the truth and I tagged a scripture verse on it. And now everybody knows how I feel and I did it. And that's, man, I just rarely see life change happening, through a bunch of people yelling, but it's this self-justification that, well, at least people know how I feel about it. And I stood and I'm just like, I think you're radically missing, the point. And the most difficult part of it all is I don't get to control the results,
Right.
It's a spirit, like, man, there's things in my life that people have been telling me for years. There's, whether it's like, just be off your phone when you're at home. Like, my wife telling me that is one thing, but the Lord convincing me and convicting me of why I need to do that is far more compelling. And so it's praying for those people. It's battling for those people instead of with those people that I think I love to try to do. I know you were going to say.
I have a question for you. Because I think what you're talking about is that balance of truth and grace. And so I know that you really have spent time in your life processing that and what that looks like. Can you give some more practical ways that you do that? Or maybe if someone's like, how do I put that balance? What does that really look like? I think like you talked about prayer, but like what does being in proximity look like? Or what are maybe some...
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the notions in our culture is that love and acceptance are synonyms, so I need to, because I love somebody, that I need to accept all of everything that comes along with them. And that's not good. I love my kids, and because I love my kids, I tell my kids the truth. I give my kids proper punishments, things like that, because I need to steer them in love towards what truth is. And so I don't just accept all of their behavior. And so there's some people that will, if you don't accept my behavior, you don't love me. Well, that's silly. Like at the end of the day, that's just a silly argument, to make. But I think it's asking curious questions and not assuming people's motives, whether that's, sexuality or whatever that temptation is, that thing that is leading them towards a lie or leading them towards unfruitfulness. But the difficult part is if I start to get close enough to somebody that I'm able to see the specks, they're close enough to see the specks in my eye too. And I have to be, and I think that's what's scary for a lot of people is I have to be willing to be called out if I'm willing to call others out. And that's what freaks people out. So it's easier to keep at a distance because then that person, because anytime I'm having conversations with somebody where I want to speak truth into them, even if they don't think the truth is there, like then I want that to be a conversation where they feel confident enough to ask me hard questions, to call me out. And then we can start to have dialogue about it. And then we can, work towards, okay, how does this work in society? How does ultimate truth, where does ultimate truth lie in this? What are the consequences? And then we're able to start it with more dialogue, but it's inviting them to kind of do the same thing to me. And that's scary. And so I think, I don't know, that's kind of where I've leaned in. Probably didn't answer very well, but.
Well, you know that there aren't many people that you love to Christ because you just argued the daylights out of them and they go, okay, I give up. I must trust Christ. It's time. It just doesn't typically happen that way. I mean, I'm sure it does occasionally, but it doesn't typically happen that way. The bigger question of culture happens more often because you're dealing with entities and institutions and organizations. That's where cultural war typically, now it may show at the tip of a spear with an individual, flaming somebody, but you're dealing with institutions. And I think that gets more grimy because I actually think people inhabit those agencies. And just like with my neighbor, I need to fight for them, not simply with them. And so the ability to form alliances of discussion. We used churches in the 60s and 70s, because there were so many of them, they were just exploding all over the place, particularly in the 70s. You didn't like what somebody else was saying in your own church, you just go start another one, start your own.
Yeah.
I think we're at an age in an age now where finding co-belligerents actually matters. People who we can work with towards something, not just something to fight with, but some people we can work with. Because I can work with Mormons and Catholics because there are a lot of things they hold in common. I still want to make sure that there's some spiritual conversations that go on. But in a social warrior situation, there's a lot of people we can partner with that we might not partner with everything, agree with everything. We might not even agree with them spiritually on everything. But I do think for common good, I think we can. And so a lot of the warfare almost belies the fact that we've given up trying. And that's what made a guy like Keller so interesting, because he was happy to do that. He was happy to collaborate and be kind with other organizations and agencies. In other words, get something done. If you're going to change the housing in a given block, get everybody you can get on the same board together to work towards that. Augustine goes the same way. Spiritual warfare and all the rest of that stuff, he got that, but he said the issue is you're got to fight the right beings and then realize that you fight the world system in order to recover the people in the world. And we spend all of our time fighting. It's not a good look.
Yeah.
It hasn't been a good look on us for a while, the more we get into the conflict point. Now, that said, I would guess, and you, frankly, you may know this as well as anybody, as pastoring, you realize most of the people we interact with are just pretty normal people. They're pretty happy. They're navigating through the world, doing the best they can. And most of the poor examples, whether it be something coming out of Kansas in some small little church out there whining, they become the magnet, if you will. Everybody's spotting on them. The average pastor is not having an affair.
Yeah.
And the average churchgoer is not intentionally trying to flamethrow people. Maybe more now with social media, but not typically. So we really have to work harder than we are in engaging the cultural system around us, because quite honestly, it only takes a handful of people to make a lot of noise. Again, if you're looking at the current political situation in Washington, it only took 8 people because you had such a slim majority in the Republican Party. It only took that many people to disrupt it and keep us for 3 weeks having no chair, because you needed somebody to just trigger something, and then they couldn't get any agreement. And it just realized how easily divided that is. Compromise, by its very nature, makes everybody unhappy.
Yeah.
But that's the system we work in.
And that's just a small microcosm of, something happening now.
So what we're saying is we'll be having this conversation for a while.
Off the air.
Well, it could well be that we're going through an arc historically, because I can see, I'm old enough to see some of those arcs.
Yeah.
This is probably the time we're going to be in for a while. And maybe another 5-10 years that we're going to see some of these disruptions. But, in Morning in America in 1980s with the Reagan era, and now the problem is it didn't list everybody up, but it sort of made everybody feel better.
Yeah.
So we tend to see waves that go by. Pendulums happen.
For sure.
And we're in a crashing pendulum right now.
Yeah. And again, I think this is one of those issues we could probably belabor much longer and talk about. And like most other episodes, there's not like this simple cut and dry answer. We need a discernment. We need to ask the Spirit to be a part of, but we need to have these conversations. It's too critical it's too critical just to over spiritualize everything or just remove the spiritual aspect from it. And so having these conversations is critical. And we're grateful that you came along, a listener, for the ride today. Sad that Eric wasn't able to come along for the ride, because I know he would have had a lot of great insight in this conversation. But again, thank you for joining us today. We're grateful that people listen every single week, and we're grateful for you. If you've got ideas or things that you want us to talk about, you want to tell us we're wrong, whatever that looks like, you can email us anytime. podcast@cccomaha.org. We'll read those. We'll respond. You can find us Instagram, TikTok at CCCOMA Podcast. You can share some of those clips. We'll be putting some of those out from this episode. And we love getting voicemails from you all.
Yes, we do.
So we can answer those silly questions, those serious questions, give our thoughts to you. You can do that anytime. 402-885-9930. But until next time, we'll see you then.